You know what's kind of funny actually is as I was prepping for this a little bit, I looked up videos of you online on YouTube, and actually the first one I saw was a fireside chat with the Jobin guy, where you had exactly the same situation, where both of you were wearing the same.
Yeah. No. Well, thanks for having me. It's fun to come to New York. I'm here relatively regularly, but I think more specifically when I started Composite Software, which is a product that really pioneered data virtualization. I was out here every other week for about 2 years selling to all the financial institutions.
I'm sure that was fun.
With IBM, so I have a deep place in my heart for data processing and certainly New York.
Yeah, wonderful. Speaking of which, tell us about your story.
I have a very odd background. I was working on a PhD almost 20 years ago at UW that would have been in an area that now would be labeled as bioinformatics. Started a couple of companies. I started a company that I just mentioned, Composite Software, that focused on how could you keep data structured and semi-structured in different locations and provide a virtual layer. So we looked like a database. We built a federated database. The software was OEM'd by Cognos and Informatica. And then the company was acquired by Cisco to be used for their Internet of Things efforts. I then went up to Microsoft and helped write the initial version of AppCache, their DHT. And after getting that out, became the first GM of what's now Azure. It became pretty clear after getting going there that they were not going to cannibalize Windows Server anytime soon. This was now 2008. And I got recruited to come back to the Bay Area and lead the team that designed and built WebOS. So kind of like switched massively to consumer stuff. It was a pretty wild experience getting an OS out in under a year. And then I was going to go into venture then. You're probably asking, like, why did this guy go into venture? It's because across the three companies I started, I had the opportunity to raise over $100 million in capital across those companies, and I saw that there's a real gap, at least in my experience, of getting investors who had started companies and could empathize, especially with a technical founder. But actually, Benchmark convinced me to hold off doing that, and went to Twitter and redid the infrastructure there, helped the company move off of Rails, off of Ruby, and built the engineering team from like 60 to almost 400 engineers.
And then moved to Kleiner.
Now I'm on the dark side. Yeah, okay. And I got to know Kleiner because the largest check that the KP's ever written was into Twitter.
Great. Any lessons learned on the big data world from your Twitter days?
From Twitter?
What worked? What didn't? What was surprising?
I
maybe.
Think, it's an interesting thing right now where the cost and ability to store tons of data is so prevalent both in consumer and enterprise companies that I think oftentimes you end up in this kind of data obesity state where you start storing data for reasons you don't even know why you're storing it. And so we try to be reasonably disciplined around thinking through, if we're going to store this data, whatever that data be, whether it be logs on users or systems, do we at least have an idea of how we might use that in the future if we were not going to use it right then and there? Because I think it's very easy to store a bunch and you go, oh, great, like I've got this big Hadoop cluster. But it turns out that like if you don't use it, it doesn't really matter. And actually, I'm an angel investor in Cloudera, and I know Jeff really well. And I think one of the things that's been a challenge with Hadoop, whether it be Cloudera, MapR, or Hortonworks, is that they're solving great problems and making it really efficient. But now a lot of larger companies are asking, where's the ROI? And how do I get production workloads? Like how do I move those production workloads? And I think we're just early on getting that done. I think it will happen. But I think we have to kind of, as a collective group of both users and producers of these products, think through what are the problems that you're really solving. And Cheng made an interesting point around thinking through, when you look at this big haystack of data, and we created a big haystack even with Composite, and now you can centralize all that, right? And what's interesting to me, especially as an investor now thinking through, is what are the new opportunities that are going to be created that we haven't thought of? Because we do tend to think of the world of the data warehouse, the microstrategies, the business objects, the Cognos. Many of you probably still have those technologies at your company. Maybe you have Tableau, maybe you have them all. But we've always kind of had this notion of, okay, I know the questions I want to ask, but maybe we don't know all the questions we want to ask. And that's a particular area that I've been spending time on thinking through. Are there interesting opportunities in the enterprise or consumer space around machine learning, One of the challenges for the earlier question is around feature engineering. And if you look at who wins most of the Kaggle competitions, it tends to be combinations of ensembles of different algorithms, but it's really the feature engineering. And I actually still write software. And recently, because I've been meeting all these companies, I want to look at what if I use pandas, which thank you for contributing. It's a great tool in Python. What could someone like myself just put together? And it was amazing. If you go to, it's a really bad website, but if you go to urfotoz.com, all it is an image recognition thing. I did not do anything magical, okay? Just put that up there. It's trained on the ImageNet photos from 2010, 15 million images, and it's actually not bad. And it's amazing to me that all these tools are available for us engineers to assemble. So I'm really excited, as you can maybe tell, that this next wave of machine learning and AI, how is that going to play out? How are we going to actually start realizing, we'll call these smart apps, or for the lack of my marketing prowess, big apps that emerge from all this data that we're collecting?
All right, so this is great. So we touched upon a bunch of different themes
that was
here.
all over the place.
No, this is great. Where do you think we are in terms of investment? So at the very beginning, you mentioned we early in terms of generating ROI for this big project. Do you think we are in a little bit of a big data bubble from an investment standpoint, where a lot of large investments have been made at very high valuations, but all those companies are fairly early?
I don't necessarily know if we're in a bubble on the financial side. I think that's a whole other discussion. I do think, though, that we have to be careful that the perception and the reality distance between some of the things that many of the people in this room are working on doesn't get too far. Because that's when all of a sudden the CIO, the CMO says, wait a second, I spent all this money on the Hadoop cluster and hiring these data scientists, which were impossible to hire, so we had to pay them 3x of what everyone else makes or whatever. You've got to solve real problems. And one of the things I learned from just building the product at Composite is really focusing on how do you kind of make sure you're a painkiller, not a vitamin. Because selling vitamins sucks, right? But painkillers are awesome because they actually solve real issues. And I think that big data as a category, it always pains me when I say it, because for probably many other folks in this room, including myself, we had 3-letter agencies using our software 10 years ago and plus, and they certainly had more than big data. So it's not new. I think there are a lot of big advances in the technology, specifically about not having to think through how you do ETL until maybe the end of the process, which is, I think, one of the big advantages with Hadoop. But I think we're still early in understanding, okay, we've got all this data, what can we do with it? And I think it will happen. I just think we have to be really cautious with the promises versus delivery.
So where do you see, from your VC perspective, what's played out? Where do you see the white space? So you started alluding to this through
yeah,
apps.
and actually I didn't even finish. So I'm at Kleiner Perkins, a general partner, joined there 3 years ago. And this is certainly an area that I invest in. I think an area that we're starting to see, I think, some really interesting applications being built around some of the data mining is specifically around CRM and in Salesforce. Salesforce recently bought a company called RelateIQ. And I think there's some really interesting work that's going on to think through how do we actually do better sales forecasting within companies and using machine learning so you could actually see, something that's more complicated than, hey, you haven't reached out to that sales lead in 3 weeks. Go reach out to them again, versus what's the dialogue? Mining email. I think just mining email in general. I think we're seeing a lot of interesting, more B2B type applications emerge. And so I think there will be others, but that's certainly one obvious one right now. I think that's actually really quite exciting.
Are you excited about vertical applications of machine learning, and
yeah, so we have, I did an investment in a company called Cloud Physics. It's a group of ex-VMware engineers that are profiling. They basically wrote ESX, or they wrote parts of it. I didn't say they wrote the whole thing. But they have enough understanding of the instrumentation around the hypervisor that they're just focusing on how can we actually provide large data analytics for the data center in virtualized environments. You can call that vertical or not, but that's one. We have another investment in a company called Zephyr Health that is looking at more on the healthcare side and for hospitals. How can you oftentimes aggregate public data sets with some private data sets and actually create some new experience or a service on top of that? So it's really an area that we're quite actively looking at companies.
What about what you feel is played out a little bit? If you're an entrepreneur in this room and you're thinking of leveraging your skills to start a company in big data, you should not start company X.
I think you have to be careful if you're just looking at the visualization component. I mean, look, Apple's indoctrinated all of us, build beautiful products, and I certainly had that hammer in my head when we built WebOS. And you need to have a great way to manipulate data. There's no doubt about that. But it just feels like between D3 and other tools, that area, it's getting more difficult to differentiate just on visualization. You have to have other pieces. Earlier on, data governance was brought up. I think that's still a big open area in the lineage side, especially when you start linking into things around like SOX compliance and like what does that actually mean. What are the other areas? I think
databases. Should one start a NoSQL database company?
Yeah, that would be probably tough. I think that, especially for the engineers in the room, it's fun to go build databases. I think you really have to go look again. What is the problem being solved? I do think there's actually an emerging opportunity, and a couple of startups are actually tackling this, which is, we're getting more and more time series data. Is there kind of a next generation thing past the vector database that was around 20 years ago for just time series data? That may or may not play out. I have no idea.
Yeah, especially with the Internet of Things that creates this need for it. Great. You talked about data science, people winning Kaggle competitions. What's your thinking on data science being democratized? At the end of the day, do we have a bunch of tools that enable anybody to be a data scientist within a company, or do we, as startups, do we build tools to enable data scientists, or both?
So I think that the data scientist term may be a little bit overloaded. Maybe just a little. Like big data is low. Look, I think there's always going to be a need for someone who has a background in statistics and it can understand how to use tools to understand what are the questions that should be asked, how to do the feature engineering, to understand your business, whether it be in financial services or in healthcare or whatnot. I do think that the incumbent players like SaaS, I think over time will hopefully be dislodged by some number of startups. I think at the same time that there will be more and more self-service tools to enable people to, maybe not everyone becomes data scientists, because I don't think that, at least in my definition, I don't see that really working, but there'll be more accessibility so people can ask more questions of the data. One of the things that we built at Twitter, and it was absolutely borrowing off of the third of the people that I recruited from Google, was how could we let non-engineers run MapReduce jobs, ask more questions of the data, because if we let more non-engineers ask questions, there was a higher probability that we would actually iterate on things, whether it be in the product or just how we looked at the business faster, right? So it's kind of like you end up doing better, making a lot of fast decisions. Some of the decisions may be wrong versus waiting to make the perfect one. And we certainly kind of steered more towards the former than the latter. And that shows that actually work to be quite effective. And so the question is, how do you enable those types of services to be built or run in any company? I think we're seeing one of the reasons I'm in town, besides talking to here and then at Strata, we have twice a year we get together with 25 or 30 CIOs of the Fortune 250. And that meeting's tomorrow. And it's been interesting to see how many companies are looking at things like Redshift and more self-service. But now, so we'll see. But I think that I think we're going to see this bifurcation. I still think Kaggle is an amazing service. I think just for accessing. I wish there was more challenges that were from the private sector. I understand why, but it's really fun to hear how a gentleman who I just brought on to Kleiner Perkins as a junior partner. One of his finals at Stanford was actually on Kaggle. And it was a little stressful. He's thinking we'd much rather have the old test than
it's very public.
Kaggle.
Yes, yeah. Failure is very public. What do you look for in startups that come pitch you, specifically in the big data world?
I think one of the things that can happen, at least in the Bay Area, is that there's different categories. Sometimes people come right out of graduate school and they like tech for tech's sake and not really looking at the problem. I think that in general, I try to determine, does this team have a strong enough understanding of what it's like to sell to the Fortune 2,000 or 5,000 to know what it means to be enterprise ready? I think that oftentimes companies greatly underestimate that and understand what that means. And so I think that tends to be where the focus is. And oftentimes, though, we might take 2 engineers that I work with and incubate those 2 folks and actually pair them up with either a product business person, or at least tie them to introduce them to the CIO at Starbucks so he or she can start understanding what that actually means. But I think in the big data space specifically, that's one. The second is really pushing on what's the differentiation. I'm a little bit of an oddball VC since I'm still running software and I kind of know a little bit about this stuff. And so sometimes people get taken back pretty quickly. I pushed hard pretty quickly on the first meeting technically, just to see, why did they make certain decisions? And I'm not saying that the decisions that company made were wrong necessarily, but I think that at the end of the day, technology is here to solve a problem. And if you don't know why you selected a particular technology, I think I'm not too sure that we would back you.
Okay, terrific. I want to open up to questions. I have one here. Yeah, I'll share my mic.
Elliot Noma, Garrett Asset Management. What new big data opportunities do you see resulting from the flood of data that we expect to get from Internet of Things and wearable technologies?
So it's certainly one of the reasons why I'm spending time in this area around machine learning and deep belief nets and looking through what's going to create that kind of next wave of extracting knowledge from all this information we're collecting. I think it's interesting as we move away from the screens to really sensors. What does that mean for all this data that's being collected, right? If you look at the forecasts are going from the 2.8 zettabytes to 40 zettabytes in 2020, most of that data is going to be coming from sensors, right? And if you look at the Google driving car, like we've been spending some time on some of these autonomous driving car efforts, like Andrew Ng's effort at Stanford and a couple of their startups. I mean, we have to actually make some pretty massive technology advances, I think, to be able to start doing really interesting AI and machine learning things that help you in your everyday life. I think that things in virtual reality are also quite interesting. But so I don't really have an answer for you of like, hey, what's great. I think all those areas, I don't think we can imagine what new applications are going to be built. So we're actually looking kind of lower level and saying, like, what do we have to be able to do, at the hardware level potentially, or even different new types of memory to actually be able to process and handle some of this.
So right now, are you thinking that it is constrained by the fact that you don't have talent enough to get some of this machine learning down to the metal as against keeping it at the software? Or is it that there are just not enough use cases being targeted in order for this to become, because it's a chicken or egg problem? Because
it's a little bit. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing large advances in companies like Google and Facebook is that they have a lot of tagged images, right? And so when you use some of these approaches that I mentioned, like deep belief nets or whatnot, as you add more data, you're clearly going to get actual higher accuracy, right? So not everyone has the volume in this case of voice or images to go train those models. So I think we're going to probably be seeing innovations from those types of companies before startups. So you say, like, as a startup, like, what do I actually do there? I think that's where it becomes challenging. I mean, I think one of the most, I was going to use the term painful, but it's more just, it bums me out when I see a company that comes in and they've got like a great technical team and they're doing some personalization technology. And, like, they'll probably get acquired because they're a bunch of smart folks, but you're not going to be able to build a company on that. And so I do think a lot of the advances are going to come with the big guys. And we'll see. I'm hopeful that, especially in healthcare, that as we move to, doing more proactive care, well, I think we're going to have to financially, that machine learning AI is going to play a very, very critical role in that. And we're starting to see some interesting companies emerge. around amassing various data sets to help companies do a better job risk modeling their employees for self-insuring, just as an example.
Just very quickly, we will take the last question
I
after
can
this.
talk offline.
Nope, that's fine. We can do it.
All right, great. Yes, one last question. Name and company, please.
Hi. You mentioned something
Just
about
your name and
public-private data
Yeah.
Or not.
coming together, public and private data sets with healthcare you mentioned, but for CRM, and you said CRM, Matthew Leadham with Verizon. You mentioned tracking opportunities or forecasting existing opportunities. I'm looking for something that will discover opportunities and spoon feed my sales force, basically.
So-
Is there anything out there that?
There actually are. And I mean, just to kind of do a quick thought experiment, right? A lot of these companies are tying into LinkedIn. They're tying into other data sources like Crunchbase or whatnot. They're aggregating a lot of company data and actually using those to drive sales leads, right? So there's probably a certain set of keywords that you can search on LinkedIn. I'll link to LinkedIn for this. That you can identify, did they hire someone new with a certain background, high probability that a certain background, he or she's going to be biased to buy that product, right? And there's a lot of companies doing really clever things for mining sales leads, not recruiting employees, although probably also recruiting employees, but using it for just lead generation. Twitter is another one. People are using Facebook. I mean, another great one is someone changes their relationship status. They're engaged. Like, okay, so bring out the wedding photographers and all these other groups, and that's great. Insurance, homes. There's all this if you look at the statistics of marriage is oftentimes 9 months past that. Different regions of the country, you could also predict maybe when they go buy a home. And so actually, a lot of companies are doing really interesting mining in data for B2B opportunities on these consumer properties.
Thank you.
Great, Mike. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.